Everyone. It looks like we have a bunch of people joining us today. So we're going to go ahead and get started because we have an hour full of fantastic information for those of you would-be podcasters, novice podcasters, and those wanting to kind of get a little bit more basic information. So first of all, I'd like to begin by thanking everyone for joining us today. We are so excited to have you here. This is our very first podcasting workshop. So we're looking forward to presenting our information and also getting some feedback from you and learning what kind of questions that you have about podcasting. Before I begin with the nitty-gritty details, I wanted to mention that we are recording this. And so it will be available on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/automatic in a few days. So probably sometime early next week. We are also live streaming this right now on YouTube and Facebook. So hi, everybody out there in YouTube and Facebook land. So we will have a Q&A panel if you're on our Zoom call at the bottom of your screen, kind of depending, it might be at the top of your screen if you're on your tablet or phone, but you'll see a Q&A panel there, and that's where we would like for you to post your questions. And it's basically like a text chat. My colleague Dustin, a happiness engineer, will be on hand answering questions from the very beginning. And so Dustin, if you want to quickly introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Hello. My name is Dustin Hartzler, and I'm a happiness engineer, and I'm a podcaster too. I podcast for the last 10 years over at yourwebsiteengineer.com, and just talking about WordPress. And so this is what I do every day, talk about WordPress and teach people WordPress. And so I'll be answering as many questions as I can. Some of them I'll save for the end. We'll throw those questions back to our presenters, and then they'll be able to answer them live and maybe even show a demo if necessary. So that's kind of what is going to be laid out here over the next hour or so. And so thanks, Marjorie.
Yeah, absolutely. And those of us who are going to be hosting, Dustin and also Damianne and Rick, they also have their own podcast. Dustin mentioned his, so I encourage you to follow them. Kind of a nice shout out to them. And we'll also have links to their podcast at the end of the presentation. So now without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our first host, Rick Midson.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marjorie. Yeah, what an amazing turnout. It's so exciting to see all this enthusiasm around podcasting. And, you know, it's a great opportunity that we've got here today to share some of the ideas and lessons that we've learned here with you. And I hope you're going to find this really useful. So I am Richard Midson. My name's Rick. For most people, I'm a podcaster, a former YouTuber. I also used to be a news editor as well, and a presenter and journalist on commercial radio news in the United Kingdom as well. And also joining me today is Damianne.
I am Damianne. I am a happiness engineer in WooCommerce. I used to also work in WordPress.com, and I'm based in Prague. My podcast is Changes Big and Small, where I talk about change and how people go about making changes in their own life.
So we've got a few aims over the next hour, and that is to tell you all about podcasting, why you should do it, how to get noticed. So we're going to be packing in a huge amount. But as Marjorie just said, don't worry if you miss anything. You don't need to sort of rapidly get down loads of notes, because you will be able to watch this back a little bit later and catch up on anything that you missed the first time around. Because we've only got 45 minutes of presentation today, and then that Q&A afterwards. And so we're simply not going to be able to pack in even half of what we'd like to share with you. So if you have questions, as you heard there, make sure you ask them in the Q&A section. Dustin's going to be handing those, and we will deal with some of those live at the end of the presentation as well. And of course, if you are a WordPress.com customer, then feel free to reach out to our support channels at any time you want to as well. One final point on that, actually, is you might be wondering, do you have to be a WordPress.com customer to benefit from this podcast today, from this presentation today? The answer is no, because anyone can podcast, and we want to encourage you to do it, whatever platform you are using. And we will show you how to set up a podcast on WordPress.com today, but the same principles will be applying absolutely everywhere. So let's get started. Why should you podcast?
One of the main reasons why you might want to have a podcast is as a way of finding your voice. If you already have a blog or a newsletter, you can actually reuse a lot of your own content to present it in a different way. I listen to a lot of podcasts myself, and the main reason is because I can take it on the go with me. If we don't commute as much these days, but I enjoy listening to podcasts while I'm commuting, for example. Podcasting provides a great opportunity for you as well as for your listeners. You can learn something new, teach something new, share your expertise, build community, or interview people. It's a wonderful way for you to explore your curiosity while also developing a new skill and also meeting your audience in a new way. I find that from creating my own podcast, I have started to listen to podcasts differently as well. Sometimes I like to play a little game with myself where I think, what question would I ask next? And this helps me develop my own curiosity, which I think is a wonderful thing for even engaging with other people. One warning here. If you think that podcasting is an easy way for you to become rich, it's not. We're not all Joe Rogan, although there are some people who are in that category, definitely. But whether or not you become rich, it's still incredibly valuable to have your own podcast. Richard will illustrate some of the possibilities more clearly by presenting the different types of podcasts.
Yeah, I should also say as well, is a podcast actually enough on its own? It's good to think of podcasting as really just the start of the process of getting hold of people. A podcast is going to grab people's attention, but then it's really down to you to decide what you want to do with that attention. Do you want them to buy your products through an e-commerce site, or do you want them to sign up to a campaign, or do you want them to experience just your creativity? And if so, then this is where a website is going to come into play. A podcast and a website combined is going to be a really powerful marketing opportunity. So in this presentation, we're also going to be talking about how to use both of those together for maximum impact. So let's have a look, as Damianne was saying there, at some of the opportunities in podcasting. And there really are no limits to what you can create. I like to say sometimes with podcasting, it's a bit like a blank canvas. And you can pretty much paint anything you want to. And the more imaginative you are, the more interesting your idea, the better. But let's have a look at some of the common types by perhaps asking you right now some questions. See what you think of these. Are you a creative type person? So perhaps you like comedy or writing fiction or poetry. Now, I actually appeared as a guest on a comedy news show the other day, and that was a lot of fun. Poetry, you might not think that's a natural fit for a podcast, but as I say, there's no rules in podcasting. So some people might love to get literally a 2 or 3 minute inspirational poem podcast every day to start their day. And then what about fiction? I don't need to tell you about the popularity of audiobooks these days, and like true crime is hugely popular as a topic for podcasting right now. Only the other day, I was helping a user actually on WordPress.com with a site that was full of short science fiction stories. And as I just looked at these stories, you could almost hear those episodes appearing in your head. So there's so much content that could be turned into audio. Perhaps also you want to do this for personal or business branding. Branding can sometimes sound like something that is reserved just for major firms, but branding is about the way that people view you. And podcasting is a hugely powerful tool for doing this, even for a firm with just one person. So if you're on your own, people like to buy from people they like. And in a podcast, they get to hear from the real you and hear for themselves your level of expertise and knowledge. Talking of business, maybe you just want to sell some products and you want to use podcasting for that. Then give your listeners a call to action in your show for where they can go to buy those products. Now, you want to ask them to go to your website and get clicking, whether it's to buy maybe a physical product or an e-course, or even if you're doing something like a video consultancy service. And then also, maybe you're passionate about a topic, or you want to raise the profile of a campaign or a particular issue. Then with podcasting, you can literally be your own news organization and provide information to supporters and people who want to know more about the topic. The point is, as you can tell there, that there are lots of different types of podcasts. So pretty much anything is possible.
I have to say that for years, I was thinking about doing a podcast, and I tried to get some other people to start a podcast with me because I really thought that it would be fun to have a podcast with several people on microphone. So kind of like a panel or a round table. But I realized that I was kind of holding myself back because I was waiting for other people to see my vision. And so the type of podcast I started with was just having a host on mic, where I would just talk about something that I thought would be interesting to the audience or something that I am curious about. You can also have an interview style podcast, which is the next thing that I transition to. So I do a combination of interviews and having myself on the microphone. You can also have a narrative podcast or a fiction, or you can make your own kind. So an idea that's going to come up again and again with us is that podcasting can really fit into the way that you want it to. It doesn't have to be prescriptive. You can play with it, you can have fun, and you can find what really works for you and for your listeners. You can host your podcast on WordPress.com. Some people choose to have it as part of a website that's already hosted. And so you could put your audio files or your video files, although we'll be focusing on audio podcasts for today. You could save them right into your media library. Other people prefer to host their files somewhere else and then embed it into their pages or into their website. We'll get into some more details of the specifics later. I created my podcast on WordPress.com 41 weeks ago because I just released episode 41 yesterday. And you can see that there are many other examples of podcasts, including Dustin's, Your Website Engineer, and Rick's, about making a hit podcast. Rick, tell us about what inspired you to create your podcast.
Yeah, I mean, for me, as Damianne said there, it's my aim was really to try and find out what makes a hit show. I've tried a few podcasts in the past, and they haven't always connected with me. And you sometimes find this when you start podcasting, and you want to try and find what is that natural fit for you. So I literally started documenting the process of trying to work out what actually makes a hit show. You know, what do the big production companies do to see if I, as an independent podcaster, could beat them at their own game? This is why my show is quite literally called Can I Make a Hit Podcast? But the point is, from all these ideas that we're sharing with you here, whatever you are passionate about, you can make something about and get it to work for you.
So let's see about setting up your own podcast. You've decided to make a podcast. What's next? Well, we'll walk through some of the setup that you need to do. We'll go through the hardware and we'll go through the software that you'll need. And there'll be some scalable options so that you can use what you have, or you can level up if you're interested.
Yeah, so we're going to need a few things before you can actually get underway. Something to record your voice, something to listen with, and something to edit what you record with as well. Now, if you look online, you're going to see a lot of talk about expensive studios and people asking questions in forums about trying to get the perfect setup, but you just simply don't need this at the start. You don't need to spend thousands of dollars or pounds or whatever currency you've got. You could even use the mic in your computer screen to get underway, or even record directly into your phone. If you're close enough to these microphones, and my phone, my personal phone here, I could, if I get up close to it, not too close so it's not popping, but I could record something that sounds really good straight from the start. Or if you have a mobile headset with a little microphone on the side, then that can sound great too. These will give you perfectly good quality to get started and get underway. Perhaps the best way to start, though, is with a cheap USB mic. The advantage of these is that they can plug straight to your computer, but most of them will sound pretty good right from the start. Now, you can check on any online store for a USB mic, quite literally that, and you will find you can get one for around sort of $40 or much cheaper, in fact. Or, of course, you can spend a lot more as well. I mean, this particular one here, this is one, if you can see that, I use for podcasting. It's called a Blue Yeti, and it's about $200. Now, I love the sound of that, and generally you pay more for better quality, but seriously, start off with a budget mic because it's still going to sound perfectly good enough. And there's a couple of different types of USB connectors. So have a look at the side of your computer and see what shape connector you have on it. You might have this one, which is a bit rectangular, or you might have another type, which is more sort of oval and shaped around the end of it as well. But don't be put off by the jargon here, because even if you end up getting the wrong thing, you can buy adapters for literally a couple of dollars, which will connect you straight up and give you great sound. You can see me putting one of those adapters in my Mac right now. If you have any doubts, of course, reach out to the maker of the mic or the retailer and ask in the forum or ask them directly if the mic is going to work with your computer.
And for me, I do actually most of my podcasts just using this headset, and I think it was about $30 or something like that. And I have some fancier mics, so like I have a Samsung and I have a Blue, but yeah. I find that most of the time I get quite good sound from this one, and it's the most comfortable for when I'm just doing a Zoom interview. So really, you don't have to spend a lot of money to get started.
Yeah, it's about having that microphone fairly nice and close to your mouth as well, which I think really gives that sound, doesn't it, Damianne?
Exactly.
So we've got a way of capturing your voice. What about the recording software? Well, for guests, for example, I did 3 interviews last week, actually, with people from Melbourne, Australia to North Carolina in the USA, and I used Zoom. Now, Zoom, as I'm sure you know in these COVID-19 times, is pretty popular and it's pretty easy to use, and it is totally free. If you've got a panel of people, then I think you've still got a 40-minute time limit, but if you're doing a one-on-one, you can just keep going, and it has a fantastic built-in option to record your conversation from the start. You can also use, of course, like Skype as well. There's Clean Feed, Zencast, so there's actually quite a few of them. So if you do a web search for advice on how to record a remote interview, that's the phrase you want to use, you will get lots of suggestions. The final thing will be headphones, and these can really be the cheapest you can find. You probably have some already. If you haven't got a headset like Damianne, anything just for, like the headphones that you have for listening on your phone or to music to will do. The thing is that when you record your voice and you have the voice of a guest coming out of, say, the speakers on your computer, your microphone could be picking that up. And that creates echo, and it can even lead to a high-pitched squeal as well. There's a lot of technology now to try and cancel this out, but it can often distort your voice and have this sort of tinny sound, which you don't want your listeners having to put up with. And the simple answer is quite simply to just use some headphones. Any will do. So we've created an audio file, which contains your interview, but where do we put those audio files so that your listeners can access them? Well, there are lots of options from free to paid. For example, Anchor FM is a free option that you can use. WordPress.com is obviously an option as well, especially if you've already got a paid plan or you want a fully fledged website to go with your podcast too. Libsyn and Blueberry also provide dedicated podcast hosting and great analytics as well, great statistics. In fact, both of those firms provide plugins that you can use with WordPress and provide different types of podcast players you can install and different features as well. Some podcast hosts will also create very simplistic sort of web pages for you, just with your podcast on it and a couple of notes. Some, like WordPress.com, obviously allow you to create a fully fledged site or even a fully fledged e-commerce site to go with your podcast to capture the interest of your listeners as well. So that's hosting. The final bit you need is an audio editor. Now, there are lots of paid and a few free options there. Many people go for free software like Audacity or GarageBand on the Mac. Audacity works on both a Mac and PC, and I actually recorded a little video earlier to show you, to give you a sort of crash course in audio editing on Audacity. We couldn't quite fit it into this, but I will share a link with you a little bit later so you can have a look at that if you are new to audio editing. There's also paid systems as well, like Descript, which is one I use, which allows you to edit audio like a word processor. So you can actually see the words on the page and you can cut out the sentences you don't want. And also things like Adobe Audition, which you can get with Creative Cloud, which allows some incredible mixing if you're trying to add in sound effects and music as well. So to sum up, to get started, you will need a microphone, some software, some hosting, and some cheap headphones.
So now that you've looked at kind of the basics of what you need to get started, let's look at what the actual steps are to getting a podcast made.
And you've got 6 steps for you. And as I say, if you miss anything, you'll be able to watch this back a little bit later. So we're going to cover planning your podcast, preparing for it, creating it, producing it, publishing it, and marketing it.
So let's start with planning. When you're starting to plan your podcast, there are a few questions to ask yourself. Why do you want to make a podcast? That's a good one as an initial question. So you might think, what makes me qualified for this? Or it could be that you want to find out more about a topic and it's a way you're going to explore that topic. Or it could be that you're already an expert and you have this desire, this passion to share your expertise with other people. What are some of the topics that you would consider that would capture your interest as well as those of your audience? Who is the podcast for? Now, people want to say, my podcast is for everybody. And sure, it might be true that everybody will benefit from your podcast, but who are the people that you will actually think about when you're creating the podcast? And so Seth Godin talks often about having your minimum viable audience, so having your tribe. And that's really the people that you will try to build a strong connection with, the people that are going to be your loyal fans or your followers, if you like to use those terms. So how long will each episode be for? Some people like to think very carefully about, oh, it needs to be less than 7 minutes, or it needs to be less than 30 minutes. I listen to some podcasts that are 2.5 hours long, and I listen to some other ones that are 2 minutes long. And sometimes when I subscribe to one that's only 10 minutes long, it does not capture my interest, and then I unsubscribe. So my point is that it's less about the length of the podcast and more about the content of the podcast and whether or not it's valuable to people. Some people could do daily podcasts, or you might do a weekly podcast, or you might want to have an irregular schedule. But I find that having a regular release cycle is helpful for generating some excitement, because we know that we can actually anticipate things, and that actually helps us create some excitement when we are able to anticipate. So by having a set schedule, that lets people anticipate your podcast, which can be an exciting thing. So for each podcast episode, you also want to think about the format that you're going to follow. So basically, if I'm going to do an episode where I'm just the only one on the microphone, then I tend to do my show notes first. I kind of map out what I want to say, the goals from the episode, and then I go ahead with recording it. Usually those podcast episodes take a little bit less editing time because I'm the one on microphone. I can use some cues so that I know where to cut things out, or I can just actually retake if that will make it easier. When I'm actually going to interview somebody, that takes a bit more time, because first you need to schedule the interview with them. Then you would want to do some research so that you can ask some interesting questions. My goal with every interview is to ask a question that I did not hear or did not find out about in my research, because that makes it more interesting for listeners and for me as well, right? And so by researching your guest, you can actually find out what you might want to ask that nobody else has asked. But one thing I find is that I have a tendency, you could spend hours and hours researching somebody. So I tend to set myself a limit of maybe up to an hour and a half or so to prepare for each episode. So if you're going to do an interview and you can have a big list of questions. So I have what I call my master list of questions. And those are the questions that could fit with anybody that I'm interviewing, because I know they're about change. They're about somebody's change journey, what they learned, what we can gain from their experience. But then there are also specific questions that I will ask per person. And sometimes for me, because I like to be prepared, I find just going through the exercise of coming up with a list of questions, it helps me be more comfortable during the interview, because nobody likes dead air, right? It's a little bit uncomfortable for everybody during an interview. If you're starting out in podcasting, you probably want to spend more time playing with the software, playing with your procedure so that you're comfortable during the interview. So for now, I have a checklist for every episode that I could know, okay, this is the microphone I'm going to use. I've done my questions, I've done my research, I've done my scheduling. Basically, by having a checklist, you don't have to keep everything in your mind. And we know that that actually frees you up to get your work done that you want to focus on. Now, how do you feel about your podcasting voice?
This is a scary bit for many people, this one. I used to work in radio full time, as I say, as a journalist, and I was a news presenter on rolling 24-hour news. And I remember the first time I heard my voice coming out of the speaker in a car, and I cringed. And I know I am not alone in that feeling. A lot of people feel this when they do their first episode. And a lot of people worry about their voice, but seriously don't. For starters, I assure you, you do get used to it after a couple of episodes, but do your listeners really care? Think about it. Do your friends listen to every feature of your voice when you're chatting to them? Of course not, right? Now, there are techniques that you can use to change your voice, but do you know what people value the most It's authenticity. So don't try and talk like a newsreader or a TV presenter. Just be you. Breathe. Show your genuine enthusiasm, your genuine interest in your guests, and talk to your audience like you talk to your best friend. Or maybe if you're doing a business podcast, you want to talk to people like a close business associate. But by doing that, people are going to warm to you for your authenticity and start to feel your warmth and trust you. You know, you already know how to sound great when you talk to a friend. So talk to your audience as friends. When I was actually first invited to present this drive time program on news radio across London and the UK, I wasn't actually asked to do that because of my voice, which, as you can hear right now, is a little bit high and it's a little bit nasal. And I was actually told by the editorial director at the time that it was because of the questions that I asked. And this is what Damianne was just saying there. It's because I was asking questions that other people didn't ask. Now, that's not through any technique. It's quite simply because I am, and I still am, just like Damianne, really interested in people and really interested in their stories. And when you're genuinely interested in your topic and in your guests, these questions are just going to flow out of you. So to sum all that up, just be you. And talking of people and reaching people, let's also talk about now some more of the ways that you can make connections and also to maximize your impact with your audience as well through actual practical techniques. So I've got a question for you again. When you signed up to this webinar, I bet you had a rough idea in your head of what you would like to make, but I bet you also had a reason that you wanted to make this, right? Now, podcasting is fun, but most people actually have a motivation beyond just doing it for fun, especially if you're in business or you're hoping to be. So a podcast is going to grab people's attention. From a business point of view, it's like one of the elements then at the top of the sales funnel. For a creative project, it's a way of getting people to know about your content or your ideas. But a podcast can't then capture an email address or provide a set of products to buy that a listener can skim through at their own speed. It can't provide more detailed information about a show or a guest. It can't provide subscriber-only content. This is where a website is going to be essential if you want to do more than just have fun with a podcast. You can grab their attention with a podcast, of course, but then you want to send them to the website to take that next step. A website is where you're going to put that extra content, your email capture system, your premium content, your shop. So with all that in mind, how do you take all this creativity that I suspect you're thinking about right now as you're watching this today and turn it into a podcast? What are those practical steps? As I say, podcast and website make for a powerful marketing tool. So how do you actually build that stuff?
So on WordPress.com, there is an option built right in for you to create a podcast. And so if I can show you that quickly. So this is my demo site that I've created for this podcast webinar. So from home, if I go down to manage and settings, go to writing, and I scroll down, you'll see there is a section called podcasting. I've already set it up so you can see that I already have an RSS feed for the podcast, and that will be something that will be important later on. But if I click on manage details, you can see these are the basic building blocks of a podcast on WordPress.com. You need to indicate what your category is. So every time you make a post, if you add it to this category, that lets the website know that this is part of your podcast. This is a podcast episode. Based on the podcast category, the RSS feed link is automatically generated for you. You want a title, and the subtitle is optional. The cover image is not optional. You need to have a cover image because this is used by the apps where people are going to listen to your podcast. And so you need a large enough image. It needs to be between 1400 by 1400 and 3000 by 3000. Now, it took me all of, less than 10 minutes to create this image. So you can see that you don't have to let this be a barrier for you to create your podcast. I did it on Canva, but you can use any of the tools that you tend to like to use. You can select your topic so that people can find you easily. Now, don't choose the topic that you think is interesting. Don't choose business because you heard that people listen to business podcasts. If your podcast has nothing to do with business, you're going to lose your audience. So make sure it matches your topic of your podcast. You'll want to indicate if there's explicit content because that's important. If you have explicit content and you say no here, this could get you kicked off of some of the directories. Put in your host information, your summary, and email address is also very important because this is one of the things that will be validated, will be checked in order for your podcast to be able to show in different podcast directories. Once again, if you decide you don't want a podcast, I don't know why you would decide this, but if for some reason there's an option to turn it off either temporarily or temporarily so that you can come back again if you have a new idea or you want to resume podcasting. Let me go back to the presentation. And so basically, the next step is publishing. You've set up the building blocks of the podcast as I showed in the demo. And now you actually have an episode that you want to publish. I'm going to show you the process that I follow myself for each podcast episode. I basically have two templates, one for when I'm doing the episode by myself and one for when I'm interviewing somebody. And for each of those templates, it basically kind of serves as a checklist for me because it makes sure that I have all of the elements that I want to include in the podcast. Let me show you what those templates look like, and then I will deconstruct it so that you can see what the building blocks are. Also, I know that some podcasters use reusable blocks, and I also use those as well for giving credits at the end of every episode. So if you're on WordPress.com, reusable blocks are something you can set up and you can use them to more easily create each episode. So let's go back here and I'll go to my posts. I have one episode so far and I have a draft. So these are my two templates. I have a solo template and an interview template. They're very similar. I'll show each of them to you. So in the interview template, the main difference is that I have a few additional blocks. For example, I have a block for tweetables, because that's one way that you can invite your audience to engage with your podcast by tweeting the content that they find to be most interesting. So let's see, in both templates, I start with an image. Of course, that's optional. What's not optional is you need to have an audio block because the audio block is where you're going to actually insert your MP3 file for your podcast. Then I type in my show notes. When I'm interviewing somebody, they usually have a challenge. So I've already have that set up so that I can type it in. I know that I want to provide the details of how to contact the user, how to contact myself. There's a lot of debate about whether or not you need to have transcripts. I tend to. I use Descript for that as well because it makes it a bit easier. If you're just getting started, there's also audio bursts, which lets you do transcripts for free. But I find that they're a little bit less accurate than using Descript, a lot less accurate actually. So even if you don't do full transcripts, it can be nice to have at least a timeline of the chat because that helps people see the value of the content to them. They can see what areas would be interesting to them and that can captivate them. Quick links are any links that I or my guest mention, the transcript, and then credits. So that's the basic template. For solo, there is a few less details. I don't have any tweetables. I mean, it's not that I never say anything tweetable, but I don't know. But for some reason, I don't include those in the episodes that I do on my own. Now, on the right-hand side, okay, I need to somehow hide. Okay, on the right-hand side, you'll see that the category I've selected is podcasting webinar. And that's important because that is what makes sure that this episode gets added to my podcast. I usually use the same featured image as the image up here. You don't have to. The featured image is used in some podcast apps. So for example, Castbox shows the individual episodes, but Apple podcast, for example, does not. And you can put an excerpt. So the excerpt is what your listeners will actually see in their podcast app. So I think it's important to do. Even though it's optional, I would recommend that you include an excerpt, even if the only thing you say is to see the full show notes, visit my website, and then you add a link to your published post. So those are the general building blocks. I think I've covered all of that. So once you've published your post, I recommend that you check to make sure that it looks the way you expect. That's a good practice, whether or not you're doing a podcast or a regular post in WordPress.com or wherever you publish. This lets you see what your visitors will see when they visit your site. Basically, I recommend that you subscribe to all the things that you share, because that way, if somebody reports an issue to you, it's not the first time you've become aware of it. That lets you catch any issues, gives you a chance to fix them as well. So now you've got an episode, you've published it, yay. And now you want to make sure that you actually have some listeners or some readers. And Rick will tell us more about that.
Yeah, exactly. Time to get people noticing you. Now, you can put your podcast just out there, but there are a lot of other podcasts out there, as I'm sure you know, and we want you to be standing out. And we could literally do, 10 webinars and 10 workshops on this topic alone. So I'm just going to literally have to run through a few ideas. As Damianne was saying there, do you do a transcript in your post, or do you just do show notes? There is so much that you can do and so much time that you can spend on it. So let me just give you a sort of overview of the kind of areas that you can work on. The first one is going to be search engine optimization. This is for podcasts as well. Think about your podcast title. Would people be interested when they see this? Would a search engine be interested if it saw it? If your show is about horse riding and you call it Ride, you might get a lot of Harley Davidson fans turning up on their motorcycles trying to listen to this and getting very confused. So you want to make sure that it is clear, and your show description as well makes it clear what your show is about. For your website, search engines so far are not good at indexing audio. They've kind of started doing it, but they're not very good at it yet. So one way of doing it is to create a transcript. Just like Damianne was saying, I use a program called Descript, which produces a transcript. It's where it sort of claims to be about 95% accurate. And at times it can be really good. Sometimes it's a bit more, not quite as good, shall we say. But the fact is that if I'm doing a 20-minute show, I've got a huge article that could be written as text in there. And using these automated tools, I can get that into a web page that a search engine, any search engine, can index instantly. Don't forget your tags and your categories as well if you're on WordPress too, because that's all going to help to classify your website in search engines' eyes. Oh, and also don't forget with WordPress as well, the publicize feature. Remember that this feature allows you to share instantly each episode that you publish. So when you actually publish your episode post, and that will push it out to Facebook, to Twitter, to wherever else, and also email your followers as well to let them know that your latest episode has just come out automatically with that. As Damianne was saying also about this whole idea of the tribe, you want to be encouraging people to join your tribe with extra information if they join up to your newsletter, or maybe give them some premium content. There are plugins and tools to help you do this on WordPress already. You can set up email lists, you can send extra information to supporters, you can position yourself at the center of the discussion about your topic, and quite literally start to develop yourself as a community leader in it. And of course, social media. I personally do quite a lot of social media. I put out generally, well, it's been a bit quiet this week, but generally 1 to 2 pieces of social media a day, because I find that if I stop, the number of people discovering my podcast drops. There's obviously a lot of platforms, so make sure you choose the one which reaches your target audience. Now, if you want to get involved, let's say in politics or a campaigning issue, then you're probably not going to find that TikTok and trying to pretend to sing along to a song is quite going to be the perfect place to do it. Could try, of course, but no, maybe not. Twitter's going to be the place to do that. Instagram, if you're into doing fashion or something that's more visual, then a podcast might be audio, but this is an opportunity for you to show all those images that you're describing in your podcast and getting people to get across to that platform to engage with you as well, or vice versa. So let's also have a look also about then getting onto the podcast apps, because it's all well and good you shouting about it, but if it's not actually out there on different podcast apps, no one's going to be able to click play on it. So let's have a look at that next.
Exactly. And so in the demo earlier, I showed where you could find the RSS feed for the podcast on WordPress.com. But wherever you're hosting, you want to capture your RSS feed link because you're going to need that in order for you to submit to different directories. Now, what is RSS? It's real simple syndication. There are other names for it, but you can look it up if you want to know more details. Back in the day, we used to have Google Reader. If you're a geek like me, you know all about that. It got ended in 2013 and it was terrible, but there are other tools that I use, such as Feedly and Reader, to replace Google Reader because I still enjoy reading blogs. Now, we use the same technology in order for us to make podcasts available. And so this is basically what an RSS feed looks like. These are the essential elements that I'm pointing out with the arrows and with the rectangles. So the important thing to know about RSS is that it lets users and applications access updates in a standardized, computer readable format. It's a plain text file, but it has details about your content, and that makes up the feed that directories will be able to use to get your new content. Basically, what it means is that when you have a new episode, your users don't have to be like, oh, should I check their website again today? Do I need to check their website again today? They will get the episode coming to them directly. And that is the ultimate goal, right? You don't want to have to be hunting people down or for people to be wondering how to access your podcast. You want to make it as easy for them as possible. So that means we need to use the RSS feed to make that happen. A lot of this happens automatically wherever you're hosting. So if you're using seriously simple podcasting, is that what it's called? Yes. Or if you're using PowerPress or if you're using WordPress.com, you will have a feed link for your podcast. And this is what you will use to then submit to the different directories. There are an abundance of directories that you could submit your podcast to. I would recommend that you focus on the top 5. Okay, maybe even 5 is too much for you to worry about, then do the top 3. But the big ones that you want to make sure that you hit are Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts because they have the most listeners. This is where the most people go to get your content. And so by not being listed in one of those, you're going to be missing out on a big chunk of your listeners. A lot of people, Spotify is beginning to grow actually as a podcast directory as well. So you probably want to be listed there. Then Stitcher's number 4, TuneIn is number 5, but you'll find that once you've submitted your podcast to these 5, many of the other directories will pick up your podcast as well. So start in order of the most significant ones, basically. So let's watch a video that Rick made that shows us how to submit to directories. And he's actually included some errors in there so that you can see how to fix some of the common issues with submitting your podcast to a directory.
So let's get this onto iTunes and Spotify then. And we can learn a couple of things as we go along as well, which are some really important lessons that people often get wrong. And I've deliberately left in here so that we can highlight it. So the first thing we need then is our RSS feed. As I say, that's the link that will tell all the platforms all about our podcast. So let's copy that. And then we're going to move to iTunes. I'll put the link on the page. This is where you submit. You will need an Apple account and an Apple ID, but just like signing up to any platform, it's a question of just following through the endless questions until you get there. Once you've got there, you can go to iTunes Connect and start setting up your podcast. So we're going to click Podcast Connect. And as you can see there, it's asking for our RSS feed. So let's give it our RSS feed. There we go. And we're going to click Validate to see what it thinks about. Now we've got a problem. Remember I put in that little bit of artwork there, which was too small. There we go. Podcast artwork between 1400 and 3000 pixels and the type of artwork. This is a common mistake that people make. So we need to go back to our feed and we need to actually select something that it can use. So let's go to manage our details. And we're going to change our cover art by clicking the button change, obviously. And what I've done is I've created a logo this time, a bit bigger one, 3000 by 3000. Remember what it said in there as a specification. Uploading it there and clicking continue. No need to actually crop it. So we're just simply going to click done. And there is my test podcast all in my feed. And of course I need to save the changes to make sure that's gone through. But let's go to Spotify instead. And let's see if we can add our link in here. So as you can see again, they want the RSS feed. So let's click get started. And then I'm going to paste my feed in there. Like so, and let's see what it has to say. Now, here, we've got another error, another key error, and that is the fact that Spotify requires you to have an email address in your feed. So let's have a look back at that in our settings, in our podcast settings in our WordPress site. And if you scroll down, you can see that section I mentioned before about email addresses. So let's add in. Let's just make up something for the moment, just so that we've got something to go in there. And you're going to want to have, obviously, a proper email address. And as I mentioned before, you can connect this up so that you can use your domain, your custom domain with your WordPress.com site. So let's have a look at that now. And let's see if we can check that feed again. And here we go. Let's put in our feed and see if it picks it up this time. Looking good. Let's keep going. So next, like that, verify you own this podcast. Now, obviously, that email address is not correct. So I'm going to need to verify, but you can see it will take you through there. And Spotify is a nice, really good self-explanatory platform for how it does it.
Okay, so that gives you a taste of what the steps look like for submitting your podcast. And so maybe you already have your first recording and you could get your podcast set up, that you could go ahead and submit it to the directories that way. There are lots of different podcast clients and they mostly pull from those top podcast directories. If you want to check whether or not your podcasting is in a particular directory, podnews.net is a great website for that. So just want to mention it. Not affiliated at all with us, but I just use it myself and thought it might be useful for some people. And that's it. Those are your steps to creating your own podcast. Let's end with some best practices from our experience. Rick will go first.
Well, there's so much that we could have said and we've got so little time. We're running out fast. So let's run through. My ones, I mentioned earlier that I do a show called Can I Make a Hit Podcast? And what I'm doing is I'm literally experimenting on myself to see what actually works in podcasts. And there is so much advice out there. So these are my tips. The first one is, and it won't take you long to find this word called pod fade. And what it means is people that have tried to be too overambitious and they've literally burned out. For me personally, my secret is to never do more than 1 hour of podcasting per night. And I know Damianne has a different approach to this, but it's about finding your way of working so that you never burn out. Build gradually. You know, the first time I made an episode, it took several days. Now it takes a few hours, including the recording. So don't try and do every good idea that you see in technique. Start with the basics and build up from there. Don't talk about what you think you should talk about. Talk about what you're passionate about. That could be fiction, your business, your campaigns. It's a bit embarrassing this, but I tried to set up a business podcast many years ago because this is what everyone else was doing and you were kind of meant to do. And it didn't work because I wasn't even in business. So people could tell that straight away. So do what you know and what you're being authentic talking about as well. Use your website as your shop front, show notes for SEO. Ask yourself why you're doing this. Use your website for that. And don't be afraid to reach out for help. You know, wherever you host, you will find people who love podcasting. There are Facebook groups, forums. Damianne and I would be only too happy to answer your questions as well. So there is a lot of enthusiastic help there from people who want to share their passion for podcasting with you.
I want to make sure we have time for a few questions. So you can see my top 5, but I'll just talk about one, which is don't overthink it. I spent a long time thinking about all of the elements of my podcast. And what I've realized by starting is that once you get started, that actually helps you clarify what you want your podcast to be about. And so you can always change. You can change your cover art. You can change the topic of your podcast. You can change any component that you want. But if you have some momentum, if you have some curiosity, if you have some interest, get started and don't overthink it. If you're on WordPress.com, just one more plug that there are happiness engineers that are available to help our customers. So if you reach out to us, we'd be happy to help you there if you're a WordPress.com customer. You will be able to find those links in we're going to share the slides with you afterwards. And so you're going to be able to access the links there. These are our 3 podcasts. You can see that our logos are incredibly different, but we would appreciate it if you would check out our podcast and see if there are any topics of interest to you. That brings us to questions, because I know that there's been some conversation happening in the Q&A.
There's just been a few questions. No, there's been lots of questions. I've been trying to answer quite a few as we go. I've got some tagged here to answer live. We've got about 9 minutes to go. And so just try to keep your answers brief, because we could go through a lot of questions. So the first one question is, so why do you podcast for your business rather than just to use a newsletter or blog or hold webinars or YouTube? What's a benefit? 30-second answer, each of you, or just one.
I would say authenticity. With a newsletter, anyone can write it. Your marketing department can write it, anyone. But with a podcast, it's you. They're listening to you. They're talking to you. They're hearing you. They're hearing your expertise and your authenticity.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect. Let's see. What is, do you guys have a favorite microphone that works for recording to a smartphone? Is there anything out there that you just have off the top of your head that might work?
I've used a
I can't remember what
lavalier.
it's called, and I actually have one in my room here somewhere.
I use a lavalier mic
Podcast, I think.
sometimes. Rode, R-O-D-E, makes great hardware that you can use and connect to your device, to your mobile. And Rick has one as well.
I don't know whether you can see that there, but it's got the little plug on the end, which you push straight into your headphone socket on your mobile phone. And that's got a really, really good microphone inside it and a windshield. And it is, it's called a Video Mic ME.
Okay, perfect. A question comes in from Katie. It says, when prepping for an interview, do people share the questions with the interviewee? Or in practice, is it, you just ask the questions as you go?
I do not. In fact, that's one of my things that I am very firm on. And if an interviewee insists that they have to see the questions first, then I usually find they're not a good match for my show. And it's not that I'm trying to hide anything from the interviewee. I usually tell them what the arc is that I'm going for. So what I start with, kind of what the middle point will be, and then what I hope to end up with. But I find that I would like the flexibility of being able to change the questions. I tend to just go with the flow of the conversation. And if I've given questions and people are depending on that, it might feel dishonest to then add in different questions. So I do not share my questions beforehand.
A very quick other take on that. I was doing a live interview on radio a few years ago, and I'd given them the questions in advance, and I changed one of the questions, and they answered the question on the paper, not the question I was asking. It sounded absolutely ridiculous. So sometimes I give topic areas, but not exact questions, as Damianne just said.
All right. Yeah, perfect. That's a great answer. Let's see what else. We've got lots of those. How would you market a podcast if you have a small social media following? If you have, you're just getting started, like what's the first thing that you could do to get some traction?
I think it could be good to join a network of podcasters. And so by joining a network of podcasters, one thing I find is that sometimes podcasters will plug other podcasts within their network. And so that's one way of amplifying your following, right? If everybody has 10 followers and there are, well, maybe let's say 100 followers and there are 5 of you, then you have a reach of 500 people as opposed to just your 100. So that could be one approach.
Also get involved in the conversation out there. So actually comment on other people's posts, you know, particularly on Twitter. If someone asks a question, get in there and join that conversation, because then people are going to see you commenting and they're going to go, oh, where did they come from? And they're going to start investigating you as well. But also on size of audience, don't get too obsessed with sort of going, oh, I need a Joe Rogan size audience. If you are reaching 50 people who love what you're doing instead of 1,000 who are kind of indifferent, then 50 people could be the most amazing goal you could aim for.
Great. Yeah, perfect. What about music? If you're playing music on a podcast, do royalties need to be paid? Do you pay that up front? What do you think?
For me, I use free music, and there are some people that are very generous, and there are websites where you can find free music, especially if you have a podcast that is non-profit or that is non-commercial to begin with. If you are going to be more successful and be asking people to pay for your podcast, I think it's fair then for you to pay a creator to create some music for you. What do you do, Rick?
I give a slight word of caution as well, and this is related to YouTube rather than audio podcasting, but there was this thing called Pod Safe Music, where you could use music from new artists who basically said, look, go for it, use it however you like. And I used this in one of my shows when I had a YouTube channel. And a few years later, I got a message of a copyright takedown because this band had now signed with a record label and they didn't like it. So I lost the revenue that I was generating from that particular episode. So I actually have used music in my podcast that's come from YouTube's free Creative Commons open source music library, so that hopefully wherever it gets out, it's not going to get picked up as being a copyright breach.
But the short answer is, if you want to use something that is popular or that has a copyright, you do need to pay royalties on it and figure that out.
Yeah,
and potentially absolutely. A lot of that.
Yeah, what is your thoughts on just writing a blog post and then recording yourself reading the blog post? Do you read the whole thing? Do you do bullet points? Do you ad lib? Like, is this a good way to let other people hear your content? Like, again, the floor is open for answers.
I was going to say, this is one of the reasons why when we first talked about doing this webinar here at WordPress.com, I was so excited by it, because you see so much content in support every day that you think this would make a great thing that I could listen to in the car. And it doesn't matter whether it is fiction or some kind of technical expertise. I think so much stuff you've got on blogs lends itself to audio. But then in terms of delivery, it's how you come across best. You know, if you want to ad lib around something with bullet points and that's the way you deliver best, and go for that. If you want to read a script, do that. That's my thoughts. And
I think it depends on your intent, right? And so if you want to highlight a particular part of your blog, maybe every week, if you have a daily podcast, if you have a daily blog post, maybe you're going to pick the most popular post for you to make a podcast out of, or maybe you'll pick content from different posts to kind of draw a common theme or a common thread. It's really up to you on what you intend to achieve with but you can reach a different audience. Not everybody likes to read, so you could reach a different audience by having a podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I fielded this question a little bit earlier too. And my advice was, yes, go ahead. You can add extra stuff. The cool part about podcasting, and I don't know if you even mentioned it, I was too busy answering questions, but was one of the cool things about podcasting is you subscribe to a podcast and then they just show up. Like, I do zero work to get new podcasts. Like, I open up my Overcast app and all of a sudden I've got dozens of new things to listen to. And so I don't have to remember, oh, I need to go over to Rick's site to see what he's talking about over there. If you want to gain some traction, you know, you put your same content in multiple different places. And that's a great way to kind of allow people to consume the content in the manner that works best for them.
I think so I'm afraid this is going to have to, I'm so sorry. I'm afraid this is going to be the last question, because we have so much information that we need to give. I did want to remind everyone, for those of you who missed parts of the podcast or not the podcast, the webinar, and you want to go over it again, it is going to be available. The recording is going to be available on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/automatic. Everyone who attended this webinar today, and even those who didn't attend, we'll get a follow-up email later today or tomorrow with a link to our YouTube channel. The recording will be available sometime next week, so make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can get notifications on when that recording is available. As soon as you leave the webinar, you're going to be taken to a survey asking for your feedback on the webinar. We really would love to have your comments, your suggestions, your thoughts on what you thought about this, any recommendations for future webinars. We definitely value your feedback, and so we'd love to hear from you then. And also, for the last thing, Jeff, my colleague, had noted this in the chat panel, but we also are hosting or sponsoring a 2-day jam-packed conference in mid-August. It's the official WordPress.com Growth Summit and will also include a segment on podcasting. Every single person who attends this webinar will get a 20% discount, and that will be available to you after, when you complete the survey, and also in the follow-up email. That discount and the link to register will be on that email. So thank you again to everyone who attended today for all the fantastic questions, to my colleagues and hosts Richard, Damianne, and Dustin for answering all those questions in rapid fire succession, just like a great happiness engineer. I hope everyone has a fantastic weekend, and we'll see you again at the next webinar.